wait a bit more, like 5 past, to allow some people to come in, or shall we start immediately?
We can start if you wish. I have started the YouTube live stream now.
Okay, then.
Okay.
So, hello, by the way. Hello to everyone. Welcome, dear Asutay, again.
Merhaba, it's good to be here. Good to see you.
So, if we start in our YouTube broadcast also, let me shortly introduce dear Professor Asutay. And then
before that, if you could make me also co-host.
Yes, for screen sharing.
Please.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, please. Thank you.
Okay. Dear all, welcome again to the departmental seminar of the Department of Economics. Today we are hosting dear Professor Mehmet Asutay from Durham University, United Kingdom. I will first shortly introduce dear Asutay and then leave the floor to him. So, Professor Asutay's career, in fact, goes back to Turkey. So he received his Bachelor and Master of Arts degree in Public Finance from Istanbul University, and then he continued to his education in United Kingdom. He received his Master and PhD degrees in Economics of Public Policy and in Political Economics from the University of Leicester. Currently, he is now the Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Political Economy and Finance in Durham University. And he's the Director of Master Program in Islamic Finance and the Director of Durham Center for Islamic Economics and Finance. Concordantly, Professor Asutay teaches and searches on Islamic moral and political economy and Islamic banking and finance. He is also interested in developments in political economy in the Middle East region, including Turkey, of course. And moreover, he is the managing editor of the Review of Islamic Economics and associate editor of the American Journal of Islamic Social Science. In addition, he is in the editorial board of International Journal of Islamic and Middle Eastern Finance and Management, and also the Borsa Istanbul Review. So finally, of course, he has lots of influential publications like journals, articles, and some books. He's the author of some books such as A Model for Islamic Development and Takaful Investment Portfolios. And today we are hosting him in online, and the title of today's seminar is In Search of Authenticity of Islamic Economics Between Heterodoxy and Orthodoxy. So before leaving the floor, dear participants, if you have questions or comments, you can write them down to the chat boxes in YouTube and Zoom. I will direct them after the presentation. Also, of course, you can ask your own questions by raising hands and turning your microphones on. So, dear Professor Asutay, I'm leaving the floor to you, and we are listening to you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Anil, for the introduction. It is good to be here, and it's good to be at Yıldız Teknik University's talks. It's a pleasure to be here and in the company of colleagues and friends. Today, my talk is very much on the, again, my usual passion on Islamic economics. However, today I thought of taking a particular turn, and since quite a number of speakers in this talk series are very much heterodox-oriented colleagues, and I thought perhaps I can look into the Islamic economics in relation to heterodoxy and orthodoxy and the tensions and the trends between the two, and therefore reflect on the matters through such a perspective. In particular, a theoretical search for the authenticity and how that authenticity has been evolving. Of course, in recent years, with the emergence of Islamic finance becoming very popular in different parts of the world, there has been an interest in Islamic finance from different corners of the world. I have traveled to many places that you wouldn't be imagined that Islamic finance are debated or practiced. From east to west, I covered, and therefore Islamic finance has brought this new debate. However, of course, my take-up is not Islamic finance, because the way Islamic finance has emerged and continue to develop, it has a different dynamic compared to the theoretical take-up of Islamic economics. Whether how much proximity we have with the emergence of Islamic finance and its sustained development and Islamic economics, that's a very blurred area. Because one way or another, the market conditions and market system directly determines the operation of Islamic finance as opposed to authentic understanding of Islamic economics. But also, looking at the Islamic economics response, we can draw parallelity, certain parallel understanding between heterodoxy and Islamic economics, but that is not clear either theoretically, as I'm going to discuss, and then highlight the particular take-up that Islamic economics have, and the underlying theoretical as well as the normative Islamic essence to understand such matters. And hopefully, if the organizers are okay, I'm happy to take up questions during the session rather than leaving to the end, but I entirely accept your, Anil and Sema Hocam, your decision on this, but I'm happy to take up the questions while we are evolving. Now, of course, one thing perhaps is more obvious to most of you, my reference to Islamic moral economy rather than just Islamic economics. And that distinction perhaps will come up later in a more clear manner. Among all those economies, as the picture on the right-hand side shows, that white one in the middle, and that is not politically chosen color, it is just what is provided by the system. But perhaps that should have been black. But by nature of it, that particular worldview, the Islamic worldview, making a particular distinction and therefore shaping theoretical base as well as the underlying axioms of Islamic moral economy is important. But my reference to morality here is not because it's religious. I have to make that clear, but the particular definition of the particular term, that is iktisat. Iktisat, although it is translated into in English as economics, but the reference points as well as the conclusions of economics, iktisat, is much different than economics, and therefore, rather than economizing Islamic understanding of what economy should be, I use the Islamic moral economy. Of course, the Paulinian sense of moral economy is very much essential, but at the same time, this iktisat terminology, the objective of what iktisat is in relation to understanding the Islamic worldview. Hence, therefore, my reference to moral economy is not because it is religious. Islam, by definition, is religion, and therefore the consequence can be morality. But as we have been debating on the consequences of Islamic finance, that morality is hardly there, rather than reproducing the existing. Of course, there are different initiatives, positive some initiatives within Islamic finance, which we appreciate, but the commercial Islamic banking in general, the consequences produced perhaps not necessarily goes beyond the fiqh or Islamic laws. Islamic laws very much fiqh-oriented or the regulation-oriented understanding into morality. So that's something that I want to reflect on. Therefore, in this talk, I'm going to reflect on those issues, but importantly, looking at this heterodoxy and whether there's a convergence or divergence with Islamic economics, because on the outset, it seems that there is a convergence. So when we map out all the knowledge systems, sub-disciplines within economics, perhaps we can see certain proximities. However, that proximity, when we go into the deeper into the issue, perhaps disappearing, or my argument is that it is disappearing, and that can be seen in the nature and the distinction of Islamic political economy. Again, my reference to Islamic political economy here is important because what I'm suggesting that Islamic moral economy is not an emergent pattern within existing, but it qualifies to be a system because it directly refers to a particular modes of production, particular value theory, and particular distribution theory, in addition to macro requirements of being a system, as well as the micro requirements of being a system, whether the incentive mechanisms, the property right, decision-making process on the micro side, but the framework and the axioms, the value system, operational nature on the macro side directly suggest that there is a particular political economy here. So political economy frame and the Islamic moral economy being the content of that frame, that is what I'm trying to argue here. So looking from that perspective, therefore, and looking at all over the world, one way or another, in particular with the neoliberal domination that we have seen since, in particular, since 1980s, and heavy financialization has taken place. And that financialization is very much interesting for us because with the liberalization of the financial systems, including in the OIC member countries or the Muslim countries, the emergence of Islamic banking was facilitated. In other words, the global system provided certain blessings for Islamic finance to create an opportunity space within the existing financial system because it worked in the interest of financialization one way or another. The capital transfer, capital accumulation was an important debate there. However, of course, the outcomes of that, and therefore looking into the consequences of Islamic finance in terms of development issues, in terms of industrialization, in terms of the new class struggle, perhaps it is leading to, in a very tacit way and in a very implicit sense, is important to look into. On the one hand, the larger rentier economy is not only in the GCC region in the Muslim world, but globally, of course, there is this rentier economy, and how within that rentier economy, Islamic finance has been allowed to play the role. However, Islamic political economy and Islamic moral economy goes beyond that with a particular call for a system understanding. And therefore, looking at all those consequences of the existing systems that we have around it, or existing system, singular, increase inequality, all those sustainability problems, whether climate and environmental challenges that we have in front of us. And therefore, when we look at the emergence of Islamic economics movement in the post-colonial period, and that's very much important, that post-colonial nature of Islamic economics is something that has to be appreciated, despite the fact that it is not debated heavily within the larger economics department and the business schools all over the world. But I think that post-colonial nature is very much important, in particular in these times that we are discussing decolonizing curriculum, as well as looking into Black Lives Matter sustainability. And within that discourse, I think the search for alternative system within the Islamic moral economy, or true Islamic economy, has been an important movement, at least for me, perhaps my bias because of my passion for the subject matter, but a particular reference to ontological base, and through that ontological base to create a counter-hegemony. Because when we look at the writings in 1960s, 70s, although they have not been what I call the founding fathers, were not articulate in the particular political economy language to identify the discourse as well as movement as alternative or creating a counter-hegemony. But when we look at the nature of the discourse, the references of the discourse is very much, there is this counter-hegemony. And that counter-hegemony, not because Islam and the others, but perceiving the world in a particular way and creating the necessary, providing the necessary definitions or initial definitions at least to the issues that we have around us, to the concepts that we have around us. And therefore, such as an important reference that I'm making, when we look at the operation of Islamic finance, unfortunately, we do not see a particular Islamic definition of what capital is, because it has taken the existing definition into its operation, but Islamic moral economy and Islamic political economy, or Islamic economics as generally known, in its essence, there is this tendency to define things authentically, and that authenticity, of course, refers to Islamic cognitive system, and that is Quran, the tradition of the Prophet, as well as the saying of the Prophet, the classical knowledge, classical experiment or historical experiment in the Muslim world. This Tawhidi understanding, the Tawhid directly refers to complementarities to reach unitarity as an ontological base has been an important factor of that. And therefore, in a very reflecting manner, the whole objective of essentializing the importance of justice in economic, social, political dealings. I know immediately a lot of us will look into the Muslim world and not seeing justice at all in any part of the Muslim world, unfortunately. But in the essence of this theoretical framework, as well as the discourse, justice plays an important role. In economics terms, between different stakeholders, establishing this justice between different stakeholders as the essential part. In other words, everything is created by Allah, and therefore everything has to be represented. If I refer to modes of production in your production function, everything has to be recognized, not only capital or labor. And with that, of course, comes ihsan. Ihsan is an important complementarity to adala, because with the justice, if we cannot achieve the outcome, then the importance of having individuals establishing equilibrium in the society, those who are better off giving up so that the equilibrium can be established in the world. Because the theoretical proposition here is that Allah created the world in a particular mizan, particular order, and that order is balanced, is the perfect, and that perfection through ihsan, because ihsan is a term, it refers to excellence, and therefore that the mizan, that order, that balanced order has to be sustained in the same manner as much as possible in that becoming process, because individuals can fall but can rise, but what is important, the becoming process of reaching to falah, the salvation and happiness in this world and the hereafter. And therefore the importance of this imperative, always when there's a failure, when there is a disequilibrium in the society, in the natural environment, in the economy, and the politics, always bringing back so that the sustainability of the existing order, the mizan order, can be continued. So the Islah part, whether individual behavior or the general, of course, is a voluntary process, rather than, unfortunately, the way implemented in some part of the Muslim world. It's a voluntary process of Islah, is an Islah or reformation, is an important part of this process. That is very much, to be honest, the summary of my conclusion. But going from here, of course, what we have seen in recent years, in addition to heterodox schools coming up and challenging certain assumptions of neoclassical economics and creating an opportunity space to better understand the social reality in economics terms. What we have seen also global movements such as Sustainable Development Goals recently, but previously the Millennium Development Goals, a new morality. But that morality, of course, what is in the essence of this so-called global morality, the initial equation is not questioned. In other words, capital is not redefined, for instance. So we continue with the same definitions, but we try to moderate the consequences. Those consequences such as in relation to environment, in relation to climate, and etc. But of course, the moderating the consequences, it always creates an opportunity space, further financialization or instrumentalization of whether it is poverty, whether climate issue, whether environment, for the sake of more financial return, such as the carbon trade, for instance, that we have around us. It is happening. And in response to that, therefore, Islamic economics, the essentialized Islamic economics response is important. But of course, the outcome of that Islamic finance is moving in the same direction because, unfortunately, this obsession with the Weberian conundrum, suggesting that no, Islam as okay, Islam can facilitate capital accumulation, and that is perhaps the problematic part of it. In an interview with Samir Amin, who passed away, I think it was last year, when he was posed that question about Muslim world, whether Islam facilitates economic development, capital accumulation, he rightly suggested that if a religion leads into capital accumulation, that implies that that morality is not there. But this Weberian conundrum that created this interior complexity in the Islamic world, therefore, the discussion in Islamic economics and finance in reality, although not explicitly, but implicitly very much responding to the Weberian understanding, no, Islam can facilitate. Of course, Rodinson's work on Prophet Muhammad and then Islam and capitalism paved the way for such an understanding that no, Islam is okay with capital accumulation. And therefore, we have this subaltern imagination of capitalism plays an important role. However, the authenticity and authentic understanding of what Islamic economics is and what is its theoretical propositions, when we look at this importance of the Ihsani governance, the equilibrium, establishing equilibrium in the society, and importantly, emancipation and empowerment through a giving up process. By giving up, you're empowering. And therefore, I'm not referring to charity, but beyond that theoretical construction of Islamic economics is very much around this giving up process. By giving up, you will be emancipated and empowered. And therefore, Ihsan works in establishing that equilibrium through giving up process. And hence, the importance of looking at Islamic moral economy from such a perspective, a cognitive system, a distinctive cognitive system, compared to Enlightenment-based neoclassical understanding, for instance. And therefore, it is important for us to understand this cognitive system in order to understand the particular proposition suggested by Islamic economic theoretical framework. Of course, one of the problems we face, the emergence of Islamization of knowledge in 1970s in particular, and that has resulted in relegation of this sophisticated theoretical understanding into very simple, suggesting that economics is economics, it's a human product, and therefore, by subjecting the existing into certain filter mechanism, the Islamic filter mechanism, we should be able to produce an Islamized version of the economics. Of course, that is very much debatable, at least on my part, because that does not refer to the ontological construct. although the founding father of the movement, Ismail Rajab Faruqi, in his book on Tawhid does not suggest that, but somehow the outcome of the process resulted into this Islamizing whatever we have around us, as we can see. And the Islamic banking and finance, the Islamization process has worked, even taking the definition of capital as given in doing the transactions through halalized manner. So that's the problematic part. Therefore, I have been problematizing that issue to develop the Islamic moral economic conceptualization, suggesting that the light, the ontology or light, as John Stuart Mill refers, wherever you get your light from, your assumptions and the conclusions can be different, or Schumpeterian view of vision. All these different visions can lead to different economic understanding. That is the take-up I'm looking into. But therefore, looking from that perspective, the authenticity issue between or beyond heterodoxy and orthodoxy. So orthodoxy is very much orthodoxy as conventional orthodoxy through the Islamization of knowledge, therefore, is very much prevailing within the existing notion of Islamic economics and in particular Islamic finance, but also within the Islamic economics discourse, you have all this different positioning. I thought of starting with that and develop the discourse around it. So when we look at the debate and how the knowledge construction process has developed over the recent years, well, when I say recent years, in the last 40, 50 years, what we see very much the realistic school, what I call them the formalists, have been the upper hand. So formalists are looking into halalization process, whether moving capital from A to B with Islamic metaphors will produce a particular Islamically acceptable outcome for us. Okay, but in that, of course, what fails, the definition of that capital, the process, the definition, and consistency of that process, but also the outcome of the process, whether that is Islamically acceptable. In other words, I can move capital to facilitate arms deals or arms production, as long as A is giving the credit to B. Okay, Islamic Bank A is giving the credit to company B. There is no problem in that process. Somehow the production of ammunition can be possible because what they would call maslaha, the public interest. They will say that there's a public interest in the production of arms and ammunition first. But that consequence through maqasid al-Sharia, the objective of Sharia, which of course essentializes the importance of human life as well as the stakeholders, sustainability of stakeholders, other stakeholders, does not recognize that. But that realistic school or the formalism, the fiqh process, Islamic law process, through Islamic metaphor, through halalization process, has been the dominant one. And then the historical school, which always existed, but has become so vocal in recent years in the face of social failure of Islamic banking and finance, referring to certain institutions, such as WACF, for instance. In recent years, when you just Google it, hundreds of papers have been written, mostly replicating each other on the WACF institution. But also this historical institutionalism refers to history rather than as ontologically constructed reality, but it is an evolving reality within the social constructivism. And those institutions, if we revive those institutions, such as WACF, we will be able to solve the problems that we have around us. And therefore, a lot of studies in recent years. And then the behaviorists has been suggesting very much the same, but focusing on Muslim individual behavior, economy as everydayness. Of course, there are certain halals, lawful and unlawful, haram, but beyond that, it is economy as everydayness is a reality. And therefore, as long as you are between very much a bit closer to realism and historicism, as long as you are within this domain of halal and the haram, the lawful and the unlawful, you would be okay. So that's a very reductionist understanding as well of this ontological proposition that I'm going to look into through essentialism. Now, the essentialists or substantivists are terribly limited. Although we can see and have a reference to essentialism or substantivism in the initial writings, the founding fathers, but of course they haven't claimed such a position. They were thinking that they are articulating what Islamic economics is. And therefore, there is no methodological reference to that. And each of these particular methodological implications, therefore, would have certain consequences for us, which we have been living through, such as realism has structured Islamic finance in a particular way, and that is very much the reverse engineering of the conventional, resulting into similar results with the conventional banking and finance, with the additional transaction cost of Sharia compliance process. And therefore, looking into how we can go beyond that Islamic moral economy, taking up a particular construct, and therefore there are certain perhaps proximities towards heterodoxy and orthodoxy in the practice, but beyond that, what would be the take-up? And therefore, although I have to be careful, of course, the Dr. Ali Khan is here and other colleagues from heterodoxy, I should be careful in my take-up on the heterodox, but in a very summary manner, without going into much. When we look at the heterodox schools, they have emerged through a particular response in relation to the positions of the mainstream economics, neoclassics. It is a response to the nature of neoclassical economics, very formalistic rigidity of this atomistic methodology that it proposes, but tries to implement, and at least it is taught all over the world. And there are biases, and those biases relates to every aspect of life. A very Eurocentric bias in particular, of course, is very much imported. Looking at the social reality, the way they look at social reality in a very constructed scientific manner, with the economics like physics having the same, or mathematics having the same suffix, indicates a particular take-up on the social reality. In other words, there is no social reality as such. And of course, gender, race, and etc., all those discrimination as part of that biases. Therefore, the heterodox schools response to those issues. But also the pragmatic approach developed by neoclassicism, or the existing conventional economic understanding, in explaining the social reality. And certain assumptions, of course, are important, which does not relate to how the social reality is constructed. Of course, the relegation of social reality to mathematical propositions is an issue. And therefore, the economics, the narrowing of the scope of economics has been an important part of that abstraction from the reality. By rejecting, therefore, such propositions, such conditions of neoclassical economics or the conventional economics, essentializing the importance of history, sociology, morality, psychology, the humanity, different class struggles, and etc., has been an important source of positioning of the emergence of different heterodox schools. Although some of them in their proximity to neoclassical is much closer to neoclassical position, while the others are far away. So when we look at public choice school on the right side, very close to neoclassical, not close, but part of the neoclassical, although it aims at providing different method or complementing the methodology in other areas such as politics, but then you have Marxism as entirely, totally different assumptions and theories. And therefore, all those heterodoxies are important for us to understand and look at, and hence look at the proximities, the convergences and divergences for us. But importantly, therefore, how each heterodox school developed a particular theoretical, methodological, and as well as the political consequence-oriented and policy-oriented positions in locating themselves in the existing knowledge sphere that we have. So the pluralities, one of the perhaps an important consequence of emergence of heterodox schools is the pluralities. All these pluralities have been brought back, extending the analysis, which of course fell short by dismissing all these different dynamics in everyday life, and therefore the partial analysis has been produced, which has not responded to the reality as happening. And this critical realism, therefore, that they brought is the rejection of the current value-free economic understanding. The postmodernity, of course, played an important role, bringing this rejection of the universal truth of modernity, played an important role, opening a new space within that. And therefore, the actual process has become an important part. I mean, when we look at 1970s, large number of books and articles started emerging on the political economy of XYZ in XYZ countries, because the whole objective very much anthropologically going and examining those countries, those localities, even countries, trying to understand the dynamics, how dynamics within those societies have emerged. In the same sense, when we look at Habermas, for instance, although he has not moved from his modernist position, when he talks or reflects on cognitive rationalities, he would say that when he come across with all these Turkish immigrants in Germany, understanding that their ways of making is as rational as his own, so certain recognition of there are other cognitive systems of knowing as possible and exist, and therefore this encounter with the others in certain parts of the academia and the scholarship in different disciplines created this opportunity space, okay? And therefore, when we look at, for instance, the rejections of atomism and referring to institutionalism, rational agent assumption of the conventional economics or neoclassical, but looking into human action-driven behavioral norms are important. Again, response, just a summary of the heterodox schools, focus on individualism by neoclassicism again, rather than that the heterodox school essentializing self-reinforcing institution as an additional or even alternative analytical units. Again, on the side of conventional economics, the mechanical equilibrium, as opposed to heterodox position on evolving open system in history time, subject to processes of cumulative causation. Again, preferences on the neoclassical side are given. However, in the heterodox sides, molded by an evolving social culture, for instance. The nature of utilitarian framework. Again, when we look at the heterodoxy, human needs and the design of institutions, how they can further assist their identification and clarification. So therefore, heterodoxy provided such answers or responses by rejecting certain axioms, certain assumptions of neoclassical economics, provided an opportunity space for us. Now, what is important for us where we are with this debate? Because I'm not sure whether Aliye is following us, but like 10, 15 years ago, looking into an opportunity space in the existing academia, where Islamic economics in the Western academia can be located was something that I was questioning. Of course, I couldn't go to neoclassical and knock their door saying that, look, Islamic economics here, whether it is acceptable, because I could see very well that the whole theoretical premises, but importantly, ontological position is an issue. And therefore, the way I could look into heterodoxy, whether heterodox economics, in terms of having this large sphere of knowledge articulations, whether it's something that can be a facilitatory process for Islamic economics to be linked to establish this knowledge map. So where in the knowledge map in relation to economics or political economy, where we can put Islamic economics? That was a question that I was asking. And therefore looked into that particular debate and had chance of discussing with some heterodox school representative, or should I say colleagues from heterodox schools. And we have come to the conclusion that yes, when we look at the criticism that is raised by Islamic economics, in the essence, we have very much similarities, okay? We bring similar theoretical propositioning, similar theoretical take-up on the issue. And a number of them, just to put on the picture, some of the heterodox schools, for instance, identified here. But what was important to locate in this understanding, the ontological base, because positivism, one way or another, determine the ontological base or the methodological base of heterodox schools at the same time, or in the majority of heterodox school. Positivism, yet there is a reference to social constructivism by considering history, sociology, anthropology, and etc. in economic phenomena. But what is important is the main ontological base remains very much same, not similar, even same. In other words, enlightenment's definition of what human is only had some of the heterodox schools went into redefining those, accepting social construction as an important determining factor of the same human that was defined. However, when we look at Islamic economics, what we see in the case of Islamic economics, was, with my take-up on Islamic political economy, it is directly distinguished by its origin, the ontological base. So it is distinguished from orthodoxy, but also distinguished from heterodox economics by having particular definition, particular position in the knowledge base. And therefore, the essence has made a difference. Although when we look at the Islamization of knowledge process, we can perhaps bring it into the heterodox circle, the way it is expressed, because it becomes an emergent pattern rather than emergence in itself, because it just use the Islamic metaphors doing the same, and therefore it's a pattern perhaps within the heterodoxy, then because then it becomes Islamic logic versus the market logic, and market logic is very much determining factor for Islamic finance, for instance, rather than Islamic logic, and therefore we can see a proximity with Islamic finance as a pattern. With the heterodoxy is more positivist. But Islamic economics as a theoretical base is more than just of course, Islamic finance take-up, but a particular theoretical position. Therefore, it just that distinction at the ontological base. Of course, that results in how we define human, how we define world, how do we understand the world, and its action on an operation level is important for us to look at. And therefore, through substantivist school, what we are looking into, particularly an ontological position where the knowledge base or the cognitive system is very much different, and therefore that ontology results in a particular worldview and particular social formation, and definitions and objectives are different, and a particular modes of production, a particular value theory, and particular distribution theory. And therefore, looking through the emergence again, we could see that when we look at the features of emergence, whether the material realization, coherence, non-distributivity, structure dependence, and genuine novelty, and unpredictability in principle, and irreducibility, again, we would be able to see that Islamic economics as an emergence, as an organic emergence through a particular ontological framework, refers to something different than the positivist school's totality. In other words, the importance of revelation here. And therefore, when we look at realism, historicity, historical school and behavioral school is perhaps closer to heterodox schools, but substantivist schools take up of what Islamic economics is beyond this pragmatism expressed by different the other methodologies of Islamic morality. Sorry, Islamic finance is important for us to consider. And therefore, I hope I'm being heard. And therefore, looking at from that particular perspective, it is important for us to understand that Islamic economics is not only suggesting a pattern, but going beyond patterns and the products, but directly relating to the fulfilling conditions of emergence and organic emergence and ontological existence. And therefore, just responding to that, for instance, a long quotation, I'm aware of that, but in this quotation, the moral story is that in order to produce the best car, we might be getting the best functioning parts from each different brand, and then bring them together to produce the best car. Unfortunately, it wouldn't work, because the performance of a system, so we are talking about a system, is the sum of the independent effects of its part. It is the product of their interactions, how those parts within the logic of that particular brand brought together to interact to get this car in a particular position. Therefore, effective management of a system requires the interaction of its part, not the actions of its part taken separately. And within that understanding, therefore, the system refers to that ontological base which determines the interaction. How the interaction should be is an important factor for us to understand. And therefore, the authentic search for Islamic moral economy is essential for us to consider. And therefore, the whole counter-hegemony part, again, the Polanyian understanding of the great transformation and how the moral economy turned into this, as he would say, unregulated market economy, and how, therefore, the rescuing process later as a double movement in different parts of the world has emerged to rescue human land, labor, and even capital is important for us to consider. So Islamic economics movements in a similar manner is a disruption process, similar times, 1950s, post-colonial period. But unfortunately, when we come to the new century, that turns into Islamic finance, and that moves into capital movement only. But at the whole promise of Islamic economics is this redefinition of the social formation and looking into the relationship between the extended stakeholders rather than Islamized notion of Cobb-Douglas production function, for instance, is important. So the well-being of all the stakeholders has to be internalized as part of the modes of production, has to be considered and produce this system, Islamic system of economy, multifaceted, of course, by definition, by referring to all the stakeholders and the interests. Such as, for instance, the initial
positioning. On the one hand, the question, how do we think about the world and whatever we have around us? What is our relationship to whatever we have around us? You have either the orthodox positioning of the right-based understanding or the privileged position that the Islamic moral economy suggests. Of course, the Eurocentric modernist ontology would refer to rational individual self-maximizing, therefore it's right. It is right because there is no constraint as such. Of course, with the evolvement of the economies, all the regulation has been introduced to regulate the excessiveness of that right-based understanding, but the privilege, on the other hand, not only, of course, Islam, the other philosophies, the other religions, essentializes privilege, and therefore whatever we have around us is given, and therefore it is amana, it's a trust to human, and therefore the importance of taking care of that trust, because the individual is considered to be vicegerent of Allah on earth. The Khalifa individual is in charge of has the responsibility to ensure that amana and the trust is taken care. And therefore, a particular methodological understanding of what human is no longer very much rational individual. Of course, there are certain rationality, but very much they contained through the Islamic law, but importantly, the morality, the substantive morality of Islam. And the objective function is now not maximizing utility, but falah, the happiness, the salvation in this world and in the hereafter. And that is subjected, the constraint is ihsan. In other words, how much equilibrium that we can contribute, individual can contribute in the economy. Therefore, this iktisat paradigm. And within that, of course, concepts and theories must be methodologically consistent in relation to their ontological base. Such as the simple question that I have been putting around. Whether 5 is bigger than 4, whether 4 is bigger than 5, 5 is equal to 4. Of course, the answer within the existing understanding of rational linear understanding is very obvious, 5, of course. But when you introduce moral constraints, and then what happens, for example, the 5, which includes interest in the case of Islamic, or it produces certain harm to other individuals and society. And 4, if it does not include all this, then 4 will be bigger for you to take up. So therefore, how the value system, I know it sounds crazy, but when we think within the value system, and we can easily see that how the equation changes, because value brings certain constraints, and those constraints now will change the equation, whether it's the maximum, which one is the maximum, because at the end of the day, the individual objective function no longer is maximizing, but falah, the salvation in this world and in hereafter. And therefore, the Islamic logic, we are looking at those positionings depending on the process and the outcome. It could be any one of them, but it could be the case that 4 is larger than or equal to 5. Because of the particular constraint. And therefore, looking at from that perspective, a particular ontological position, as we can see here, which makes a particular distinction. And also, when we look at, of course, the definitions of Islamic economics and finance, okay, looking at those definitions emerged since late 1960s, early 70s. When we look at all those definitions, either establishment of justice or prevention of injustice. And that's important take up in terms of what is Islamic economics. It is no longer is the limited resources and unlimited demand, but it is very much looking at this essentialization of justice in the definitions, either essentializing justice or prevention of injustice. And methodologically as well, what we will see, the objective function, the falah individual, the individual trying to reach falah, the happiness, salvation in this world within that constraint, within that morality in this world, and ensuring in the hereafter. And in order to be able to reach in the hereafter, how much ihsan, how much socializing one individual can do to others. And therefore, a particular, as we can see, how the cognitive system defines entirely different sets of, provides different sets of definition when it comes to issues. And therefore, when we look at from İktisat perspective in particular, to understand the particularities of so-called Islamic economics or Islamic moral economy, as I call İktisat in particular, referring to that directing towards an objective, the true path in line with the aim, equal or temperate, just share and justice, giving the right of everything, to locate everything in its place, establishing justice. So when we look at the meaning, the word meaning of İktisat, because Arabic has that opportunity for us to look into the roots of words and develop a particular understanding out of that, we see that the whole giving the right of everything, locating everything in its place and establishing justice, in other words, the sustaining of the mizan, the balanced world, through ihsan, socializing process is important. And therefore it results in this emancipation process and leading to empowerment, a stakeholder development, understanding, considering all the stakeholders. And in this, we are talking about extended stakeholding, because everything created by Allah becomes a stakeholding in the process. And therefore the embeddedness, the economy is not independent of the value system, but directly located within that. And therefore, falah-seeking individual through ihsan establish a particular social formation is important to consider. And looking from that perspective, therefore, when we look at the theories and the institutions, how they emerge, for instance, is important for us to look into. And here, benefiting from Portes, it is just moving, benefiting from Portes, looking into how institutions and theories can emerge by directly referring to values, norms, and cognitive system. And cognitive system is important, as cognitive repertoire is important as well. But beyond Portes, what we did, we established a dotted line from norms to cognitive repertoire to essentialize this filtering mechanism, whether the existing practices can fit into Islamic normativeness, resulting in defining the roles. What is capital? What is capitalist? What is, sorry, not capitalist, but the capital owner? What is labor? What is labor owner? And etc. All those definitions, whether it is the labor, whether the human effort, and etc., and hence emergence of institutions. And within that, of course, have different ontologies and epistemologies. Time is an issue, therefore I will pass this part, but how different ontologies and epistemologies can result in a particular worldview, how that can worldview result in a particular system, and that particular system how defines modes of production, value theory, and also value theory, and also the distribution theory, and providing all those definition, who is capital, what is capital, who is capitalist, who owns what, how long, and etc., capital, labor, and etc., through a particular social formation. In other words, what you would have, for instance, in terms of Islamic political economy, the order. That order emanates from Islamic ontology, as opposed to Enlightenment ontology on the conventional sense. And that relates to what we call unitarity and complementarity. Everything complement each other in order to reach unitarity. So that unitarity, by definition of itself, it refers to complementing things to reach unitarity. In other words, everything that is created at the end is a reflection of God, Allah, and therefore everything has to complement each other. So therefore, we are no longer discussing the competition-oriented right-based understanding, but the privileged understanding. So competition is by definition is rejected here because everything complements each other. However, in the conventional sense, you would consider everything competing with each other, capital and labor, for instance. However, here they complement each other, and therefore resulting in emancipation and empowerment of individual that results in a particular worldview, how we see and locate human, and that is İktisat definition is very much important for us. The whole privileged definitions, falah for human and the ihsan for society, the resulting in a particular social formation, and that embedded in the sense because it has to embed into the Islamic value system, and that resulting in a particular social system, political system, economic system, all this system. What is important too is how that ontological base link all these particularities to produce a particular system is important for us to consider. Then, of course, the modes of production, value theory, and distribution theory. And therefore, on the right-hand side, if you look at, and therefore you have this vertical construct, which is ontological, as we can see. However, there is no denial that the everyday life is socially constructed. But what is important, in other words, these systems, when it comes to system part, now we are moving into the social constructivism. But that social constructivism, of course, constrained by ontology. So horizontally, when we look at horizontally, now we are talking about the realities of its society. On the one hand, vertically, we have the ontological principles, ontological axioms to constitute a particular system and its reflection, and hence it remains as a pole. If I use the words, everything has to permeate around that. Fit into that and should be accepted by the ontological construct. So the social constructivism of the evolving societies in relation to and verified by the ontological construct. And here, if I use Bordeaux's terminology, how the horizontality from one society to another can be different. Of course, the principle remains at the heart, how field, capital, and habitus will play an important role. The geographies are different. The capital available in its society, GCC has oil, some other countries have agriculture, for instance, inevitably, and also resulting habitus. But what is important, each one of them, as we shown in the previous one, has to be subjected to a particular norm. I shouldn't have done that, but in other words, how the cultural repertoire should be filtered through the normative base of the society, so that the social constructivism is in line and consistent. In other words, practice is consistent with the ontological construct. Now, when it comes to the social constructivism part, there are certain proximities with the heterodoxy, such as we are talking about power relationship, class relationships in societies, and challenging them so that the justice and ihsan can be essentialized. Perhaps we have certain proximities, but again, that does not make Islamic economics within the İktisat understanding heterodox, but there are certain areas of collaboration and expression towards existing structures, and therefore the proximity. But this understanding of the vertical, direct ontological construct, then that results in socially constructing in relation to field, capital, and habitus is important for us to understand, and the relationship between the two, how the ontological construct directly ensures the social constructivism, the way it works can produce the results in line with Islamic ontology. And therefore, that brings us the whole Islamic moral economies base, the mizan, the essential, that Allah created everything with an order, and any departure, then disruption and transgression from that mizan, from the order, results in tensions and crisis. And therefore, all the stakeholders of the creation to be given equal opportunities for their growth and development as the fitra or the creation requires. And therefore, for instance, poverty would be because of the denial of accessibility to resources created by Allah. Environmental crisis would be denial of the opportunity space of the environment to develop. Social crisis, again, denial of the right of each actors to function. Economic crisis, denial of each factors of production, the opportunity space to develop and get their due rights due to privileges. Again, human rights, denial of individuals to develop as their fitra or creation. And therefore, Tawheed here constitutes the base, the complementarities. Every stakeholder's interests complement each other. And that's important for us to consider rather than competition. Therefore, cooperation is essential here. And the Adala and Ihsan, as we discussed, it is there to ensure the relationships between all the stakeholders established according to Adala, and the Ihsan is to establish equilibrium in the society when Adala is not enough to ensure that equilibrium towards Mizan or the balanced world within the Tawhidi understanding. Tazkiyah essentializes that, yes, everything has been created and individuals, including created with a potential to develop, but that, to grow, but that growth has to be in line with the other stakeholders' need to grow, and therefore establishing growth but purification. And therefore, for instance, zakat, the alms giving, is not a charitable giving, but it is rather the right of the society to be returned to society as part of these complementarities of Tawheed, but Adala and Ihsan, as well as Tazkiyah, because Allah created all the resources for everyone. Everyone's risk is provided, but with the privatization of those resources, when people are excluded from accessibility, their rights have to be returned to them through particular institution of zakat. Again, Rububiyyah suggests that Allah created everything and everyone with a perfections, with a development path towards perfection. Therefore, that has to be again provided. Similarly, everything that we have around us is amana or trust, and therefore the methodological based maqasid al-Sharia or the objective of Sharia looks at everything that we have around us, their well-being. So maqasid al-Sharia or the objective of Sharia is defined as well-being of all the creation. So therefore, whatever action we have, economic, political, social, well-being has to be essentialized. And therefore, this solidarity understanding, the responsibility understanding has to be considered within this particular frame. And therefore, resulting in an embedded understanding of what economy is. And here, of course, typical moral economy, the whole importance of community, the reciprocity, the fictitiousness, coordination, the commodification, essentialization of justice, distribution, and importantly, the inherent value. So the value theory of Islamic economics, moral economy, is very much the inherent value, regardless of the exchange value or the use value. Because of the creation, you have a claim on whatever produced around, therefore the inherent value. And therefore the importance, for instance, zakat, to ensure that when people are excluded from the resources that are created for their accessibility, they should be compensated for through zakat. And therefore, within this understanding, the collective action, the real economy, etc., is important, such as even in Islamic finance, although it has moved very close to market logic, again, you are not supposed to buy or sell things which are not tangible, for instance. Therefore, the fictitiousness. Of course, in recent years, all these new trends of toxic products coming into Islamic finance as well. But despite that, fiqh, the Islamic law, essentializes that. And therefore, when we look at within that embeddedness, within the ontological base of Islam, it is not the prices, as Borda would say, that determine everything, but everything that determine prices. And that is important for us because within the Islamic economics and finance circle, there are colleagues, the realist school would suggest that, for instance, referring to Ibn Taymiyyah's one statement that the price established in the market is the price of Allah, suggesting that you have to accept the market price. But of course, they fail to understand market system as opposed to market as a place of exchange, the pazar. So the mechanistic difference. Secondly, and importantly, when Ibn Taymiyyah refers to the price of the market, that is a product of this embeddedness. In other words, Islamic social formation creates those constraints for price to emerge through that morality, then that price is the market system. Otherwise, market mechanism. Otherwise, it's not the price that the market system produces that can be considered the price of Allah. So those distinctions are important for us to consider. Therefore, coming close to conclusion, and therefore within that understanding, when we put all this together to establish the micro foundations of this Islamic political economy, so Tawhid is there, we can see that determines the values, norms, cognitive repertoires, roles, and therefore the theories and institutions emerge through that, so that the well-being of the stakeholders through Maqasid Sharia can be essentialized. Of course, Rubaiyah is another constraint that everything's and everyone's development path has to be recognized. Tazkiyah suggesting that the growth with purification has to be defined and described, and therefore suggesting an embedded social formation. And looking through that, of course, how the Islamic political economy frame through Islamic moral economy can be constituted, looking at Islamic moral economy as a constituent and Islamic political economy as a frame, and therefore the knowledge base, the content, the knowledge base being the ontology and epistemology, articulating Tawhid and Rubaiyah, and then the content looking into Adala and Ihsan, as we discussed together with Tazkiyah, and the process, of course, looking at the individual behavioral norms between contemplation and action. Therefore, the center, for instance, that's the benevolence, that's the ihsan, the expansion of that, and the contraction will determine whether the actual outcomes are in line with the expected outcomes as defined in the ontology in the beginning, the vertical and the horizontal relationship, in other words, so that how justice can be essentialized. Just with examples, I'll finish with this one. Therefore, for instance, everyone nowadays talks about riba, and whenever we talk about Islamic economics, everyone immediately makes references to riba. But when we look at whole riba understanding, or the prohibition of interest, why interest prohibited? Everyone refers to social justice, but what is that social justice? And in other words, here, Islamic economics with the Islamic ontology tries to bring a new definition of what capital is. But importantly, it decenters capital. It tells us that capital is not in the initial function of the modes of production of Islam, but enters into function as a secondary level. In other words, it decenters capital. It relegates its hegemonic power through prohibiting the zakat to the same level with the other stakeholders, because riba, or the prohibition or the interest, is considered as expropriation. Expropriation because of particular position, particular hegemonic position that capitalist has, and therefore reducing the position of capitalists has been the objective to establish that society of equalities and equity, and hence the hegemony and the hegemonic power of capital has to be reduced, and that's through riba, so that the expropriation can be prevented, and that ihsani society, that mizan, can be sustained in the society. Therefore, prohibition of riba, as we see around us nowadays, is not only instrumentalization for capital movement, but it is essentially a political economic constituting a society in a particular way. Again, zakat, as I mentioned, it is the right of the society that has to be returned to society, because everything is created by Allah for everyone. Therefore, exclusion through private production, private property, result in people prevented to have access. In order to overcome that prevention of accessibility, those people who are excluded from resources has to be compensated. Hence, there is this universal income, the basic income approach that we have here. So ihsani governance and ihsani society. And therefore, looking into whole modes of production, the value theory and distribution theory, so Islamic modes of production, bringing together all the stakeholders, depending on, of course, ontologically determined, but also vertically looking at the society, the social construction, and looking at capital, field, and behavior. So what you see as well, just remember, for instance, Cobb-Douglas function, you have capital and labor. Instead, what you end up here is one, human cannot be commodified, therefore it is not labor, but human effort. You have land, environment, you have capital, you have society, you have other stakeholders. When we look at, while ontology does not directly determines what the others should receive as part of the distribution theory in the process, while value theory, we have it, but distribution, when it comes to distribution theory, the ontology only determines the right of the society. The right of the society through zakat, it determined in the Quran. In other words, because the risk, everything is provided by Allah, and therefore exclusion means they have to be compensated through Quran. And when we look at zakat, unfortunately, in nowadays, zakat has been part of this rentierism, and therefore you might have hundreds of flats, whatever the numbers, but you pay only zakat from the rent rather than the property itself. However, for instance, when it comes to animals, domestic livestock, you pay directly from number of animals that you have. If you have camel herd, you are expected to give number of camels, and those camels have to be younger than 2 years old so that it can contribute to the empowerment of those people who receives, such as milk, as well as the babies, so that the family can get better off. But therefore it has to be female and younger than 2 years old, so that the transfer can empower those who receives an emancipation process on both sides. But importantly, what you see here, unlike, for instance, Cobb-Douglas production function within neoclassical, each factors of production, if I use the word, goes into equation as independent, rather than capital getting alpha and labor getting 1 minus alpha. Each has a particular supercrete, alpha for human effort, beta for land, and etc. So each one is considered. And why is that? Again, the inherent value by creation, because Allah created, regardless of how much we contribute into the process, by creation, and there is this expectations that people should live in dignity. And therefore, in order to ensure that, as you can see in front of each factors of production, you have one coefficient, A, B, C, D, E, which implies again that inherent value. So the inherent value determines the value and distribution theory beyond the use value and the exchange value, which is common, of course, in most of the heterodox schools, as well as, of course, in the neoclassical schools. There are exceptions, of course, but the generalization. So therefore, those distinctions are important for us to consider. Individual function is the objective function is very much the individual's own, but plus the falah of individual, the emancipated individual's salvation, plus how much he or she contributes to other stakeholders, well-being plus in the hereafter, subject to how much one can do in this world. And again, the governance, we are talking about the extended structural, very much structured stakeholder-based governance system as opposed to shareholders. Everything that we have around us is part of that governance system, and their expectations, the Rububiyya, the Tazkiya suggested, their expectation and opportunity spaces for their development has to be considered. In sum, sorry, I have taken longer. Islamic political economy, therefore, here suggests a particular system, and Islamic moral economy suggests a particular content. And therefore, when we look at authenticity is provided through this vertical determination or the ontological determination, the combination of system and the content within the Tawhidi understanding, so that the emancipation and empowerment can be achieved. And this counter-hegemonic process, and of course, it suggests a particular counter-hegemonic process or the challenge or response. But of course, in the modern times, this has been halted with the emergence of Islamic banking and finance. And therefore, in recent years, unfortunately, we do not see much research on Islamic economics or Islamic political economy, but everyone's attention is very much how we can move capital from one place to another. In other words, the whole very complicated, very sophisticated system has been relegated to Quranic verse, which has been taken out of the context. Riba is haram, the interest is haram, and trade is halal. But the nature of that trade is never considered in the process, or other verses in the Quran in relation to theoretical proposition that I'm proposing here is not considered. And therefore, authenticity is beyond such simplifications as we have seen around us, unfortunately, through realist school, but the substantive morality suggests a different worldview, a different ways of organizing society, and the whole vertical emergence is an important part of the process. We'll continue, of course, to research and look at different dynamics of theoretization Islamic economics through Islamic ontological base by essentializing that morality. But of course, the research is terribly limited, and we hope that through such events, we can increase attention to the theoretical form of Islamic understanding, and how, therefore, we can reconstitute Islamic economics beyond what we see this Islamic finance. And therefore, as I always conclude with Rumi, how pleasant is to flow without blurring and freezing, because now we have within this blurring and freezing part, and it is necessary to say something new. Although the new in this case refers to ontological construct, which is of course historically old, but of course that historicity does not consume it's revealing itself in every time. And therefore the whole becoming process, rather than the modernist understanding of be or being, but the becoming process is important foundational base, so that the Islah process, the reformation in relation to the vertical dimension can be considered. And I should stop there. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. So, and now, of course, we are waiting for your questions or comments about this presentation, and also for those in YouTube. Yes, dear Ersan.
Okay. Professor Asutay, thank you very much for your very timely, well-organized and comprehensive presentation. I benefited very much personally, and I have a couple of questions.
Certainly.
But after Professor Ali Khan's comments, if you allow me, you know.
Yes, you can.
Thank you. You see, I am much behind you and much slower than you. this talk for me is too rich. It is not for an hour, 20 minutes. There is a book here. This talk is full of erudition and learning. It is a talk on Rodinson, on Habermas, on Bourdieu, and on Tawheed, on post-colonial literature. Edward Said has a trilogy on Orientalism, the Palestinian problem, and covering Islam. The covering Islam is very important because covering here means covering up and covering in the sense of journalism, reporting and representing Islam. So there are too many themes here. My mind gets dizzy. So, but it is good to have it all here and to be exposed. But I would like, I think there are many interesting moves here.
Mhm.
The post-colonial move, other moves. But I would just like to single out, and this is not, you use the word comprehensive. I am making my comments opposite of comprehensive. They are very ad hoc and random, just the idea which comes to me. And he makes many moves. I would need to have quiet walks in some garden or in some coffee house without raising voice, without thinking, without talking necessarily, with silences, because this is all deep stuff and these are all deep issues. But the move that affected me most is look. And this is the last slide. I screen saved the last slide. To do something new, find new containers. Don't put the same thing in the old containers. Don't just substitute. So IMF has a book with two distinguished economists, one Pakistani who is now retired, the other Iranian, Abbas Mirahor and Mohsen Saeed Khan. If you look at the models, this book I think is around 80s. If you look at the model, they take the standard macroeconomic model,
Yes.
and wherever R is there, they put R equals 0.
Yes.
What are we doing? And it is being put out by IMF.
Indeed.
So let us get serious.
Indeed.
Why is IMF interested in this? And what are they doing? So let's move back. And as the professor emphasized, ask fundamental, simple questions. What is capital? What are the categories? So I will just now stop by putting two things on the table. One, you are not utilitarian, you maximize falah. But you see, I have problems with maximization itself.
Certainly.
And in that sense,
Quite
enlightenment, the enlightenment methodology is a problem. It's a problem for Europe. So I have this, if you look, just a book recently has come out from my dean, the Italian Renaissance, the humanities, the emergence of the humanities, 1400 to 1800. The Enlightenment overturned it. Those are the thinkers who are our allies, not the Enlightenment thinkers. So we don't just say, instead of maximization of this, we maximize that. Instead of a micro foundation of macro Nash program, we give micro foundation of Islamic economics. No, we wipe everything clean. We go back to deeper thinkers. We go to Lorenzo Valla, a whole host of thinkers in the book, Angelo Decembrio. These guys were cleaning their manuscripts which they received. They were going back to the origins of Christianity. We have to clean the manuscripts which we have received. So let me then make a, this is not my talk, this is Professor Asutay's talk. I am very stimulated and I learned a lot, but not yet learned. I learned how much I have yet to learn. But I will put only this thing on the table. And I don't want Professor Asutay to take it as a criticism. But there is a word called reification, to commodify things. So we commodify orthodox economics. Then we commodify heterodox economics. Then we commodify Islamic economics. So let us think in terms of Venn diagrams. So you have a circle, orthodox economics, another circle, heterodox economics. Now let us place Islamic economics within this circle. That's what I heard. But I would say, no, let us take orthodoxy in a very diffused form. And heterodoxy, don't interpret it as another circle. Interpret it as an absence of orthodoxy. And so you have linearity, think of non-linearity. You have convexity, think of non-convexity. The problem with the non is it can't be specified. So there is no placement here. The spatial metaphor does not hold. And then perhaps a genuine conversation can begin in which we question this whole question of anti-non-enlightenment ideologies and its basic epistemology. It's not ontology, it is epistemology. It is how knowledge has been partitioned, how ilmul yaqeen has been divided into society, studied by sociologists, polity, studied by political scientists, anthropology, studying community, cognitive psychology, studying intellectual. This partitioning, this breaking of these boundaries must be broken. And then we are right there. Then we just redo it. So I must thank you. I must thank you for allowing me these 3-4 minutes. And please enlighten us with your comments and discussion.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I'm really grateful. I guess some of the issues did not come across the way I intended, but we are not, therefore, I try to conclude that the relationship with orthodoxy, anyway, is not there, despite the fact that since 1970s, there has been this orientation towards Islamization of knowledge, which has not worked. It created, unfortunately, Ibn Qayyim, from many centuries ago, he stated that in order to overcome the riba, interest, you will create certain structure which will produce more harm than riba itself, and that is not acceptable according to the justice of Allah, he said. So therefore, the Islamization process aimed at bringing that orthodoxy into, but it didn't work. And therefore, in our case, we are taking up not as orthodoxy as part of the Islamic economics, but Islamic economics or the İktisat is entirely in its own circle because it doesn't share the ontological base. And that's important for us. Also, the compartmentalization you mentioned, and that is an important shortcoming of that, what we have observed in the knowledge development in the conventional sense. However, within the Islamic economics, what our suggestion is that we have to overcome, because Tawhid is the base. So with the compartmentalizing, you are creating partial analysis. However, Tawhid suggests complementarities to reach unity. And therefore, Islamic economics have to be expressed, one, on knowledge base, two, articulation of that knowledge in terms of economy has to reflect all those complementarities. In other words, economy cannot be segregated. I think there was a slide, I missed that out, but such as Mohammed Bakr Sad's fantastic articulation of Islamic political economics, suggesting that you cannot take out riba out of the context and try to do riba-free, interest-free transaction if the system itself is not determined by the ontological base of that particular system. And that is, therefore, we are trying to overcome those distinctions, establishment, those compartments, and provide the totality of understanding as much as possible. As you mentioned, this is, of course, is a huge debate. I wish we have workshops to continue to discuss this, each aspects of the issues. But again, as referred to what you suggested, indeed, my position is to redefinition of all those concepts, and perhaps in the end, you would end up perhaps you do not have such concepts in your ontology, such as banking, for instance. Of course, the modern reality. The question, as you refer to adverse side, for instance, despite the fact that certain colleagues suggesting that Islam should be blamed for underdevelopment because it didn't produce financial intermediation. However, that denies the ontological base that the financial intermediation is not the concern of this particular ontology. And therefore, bank, by definition, did not come out of this particular ontology. As Edward Said will say that, look, you are using your frames and you're looking at other frames and suggesting that because it doesn't fit into yours, so if your frame has banking and the other societies doesn't have banking, do not have the banking system, then you're saying that these are underdeveloped? No. They cherished without having those, but then with the colonialism, of course, and then the modernity imposed, and therefore such realities have been imposed on the rest of the world, including the Muslim world, and therefore that created that tension. So the issue, perhaps, bank is not there historically, is because the ontology doesn't suggest it. Because why? Capital accumulation is not something that is favored by Islamic ontology. Rather than accumulation, the whole object of the ihsani is the using for the entire development of other individuals and societies. Therefore, for instance, the so-called references made to Islamic State, but when we look at the tradition of the Prophet and the initial Khalifa, there wasn't a state as such anyway, but the Baitul Mal, where the zakat, for instance, collected, the whole objective was to not a surplus-oriented state, but the distributional state, establishing that equilibrium in the society between different stakeholders. And therefore, all these definitions are indeed different. If I have come across using the word maximization, my apology. That did not intend, because we are not suggesting that falah can be maximized. No, because the Islamic conceptualization is a becoming process. You do not know. The maximization, therefore, within that not knowing cannot happen, cannot take place. But it's a journey. And therefore, rather than the modernist position of be or being, Islamic process is becoming process. Only Allah knows. And therefore, I always refer to this when great scholars of Islam, for instance, when they finish their speeches, their lectures, and their books even, in the end, they will say that Allahu Alam, because we do not know. This is only an articulation, because it's a becoming process. Only Allah knows. We do not know whether. So the becoming process, whether you reach or not falah, you wouldn't know. Therefore, you cannot maximize that falah, for instance. If I have come across that way, my apologies, but that wasn't the intended meaning. But I fully agree with you, therefore, opening a clean page, a very Rawlsian understanding of the veil of ignorance and looking and placing things to its right places. Therefore, my starting point is the references to Iktisat, because Iktisat directly, the definition suggests that in an authentic sense. And therefore, I fully agree also your criticism on the colleagues who have produced such work through blessings of IMF and bringing those methodological understanding, internalizing that, I fully agree. And I feel that this is Islamic washing of the existing continuation of that Islamization process. Unfortunately, one of them recently, for instance, suggested that capital is like a blood. In order the body to continue, you need to have the circulation in the body, the blood has to be there. So capital is essential for a society. And that, of course, reflects a particular understanding, which I do not share within this İktisat understanding. But thank you. I fully agree. The passion is there. Hopefully, we can motivate the younger generation as well to develop interest of opening this clean page. And we can start these debates or defining, describing, and perhaps ending up that perhaps some of the concepts that we are heavily essentializing is not necessarily around us. But that's important. So the ontological base, making reference and articulating that, hopefully we can do with this new generation emerging. But what is important, this moderating the consequences type of models that have been imposed now with the sustainable development goals as well, is taking over everything. And that is really disturbing because that doesn't question, again, the initial equation. And therefore, we have to get, whether Islamic or others, such as I really get excited with Pope Francis' discourse, but unfortunately, Vatican has ended up with the same failure as Islamic finance because they come up with the inclusive capitalism in the end, despite the discourse that Pope has been developing. But these are all to be acceptable. The condition of acceptability imposed, of course, by a neoliberal condition, which has happened to Muslims through Islamic finance. It seems that the Vatican Church as well has gone to that route. That's pity. But hopefully, with the new generation, we can motivate individuals and look into such matters before commodifying the Islamic knowledge. And that is unfortunately what is happening. But thank you very much for your comment.
Yes,
yes. Okay. Professor Asutay,
yes.
As probably you follow the hot debate
yes.
in Turkey, over causes and consequences context, inflation, between inflation and rate of interest. Standard textbook says that increase in inflation creates an increase in rate of interest. But Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan suggests the reverse, From the Islamic economics point of view, how do you comment on that?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'll perhaps thank you for your question. I was expecting this because it's a hot topic in Turkey now. It seems that when politicians have to rescue the situations, and most of the time religion is an important part of the process. And that is what's happening in Pakistan. Zia-ul Haq tried the same thing. But of course, such comments, on the one hand, the essentialization of prohibition of riba is important. But on the other hand, my earlier reference, without contextualizing and without providing the entire system and trying to prohibit interest, it doesn't work. So the nas that he refers to cannot be relegated to prohibition of interest, because as we have gone through, we are talking about a system here, and an entirely different system. Without essentializing those qualities of justice, ihsan in the society, then just the prohibition of interest, as in some parts of the world, the Islamist movement has come up with only hudud laws, just punishing people. It is the same thing, unfortunately. It doesn't result in productive understanding. And I resemble this one in one event in Turkey. I think it was 2 years ago. President was present and he raised the importance of Islamic finance. After that, one of the journalists approached me to ask me to comment on it. After I commented and essentialized the importance of Islamic economics, then the next question the journalist asked to say that, well, it seems that Turkey is not benefiting from the capital markets and how we can do that. So as you can see, confused minds, terribly confused and terribly commodified Islamic understanding in the process. While you're head of a government which is committed to excuse me, to read its constitution as well as the party program to neoliberal policies, and then trying to rescue the process just using the interest rate debate doesn't make sense. Within the existing system, unfortunately, the textbook definition is clear out there. Of course, we hear that there are different policy suggestions. We have to see whether there is any policy suggestions in terms of getting the exchange rate terribly, Turkish lira terribly devaluated. But to be honest, if I have to tell you that, I think it was 2004, in one of my articles, I mentioned this, Prime Minister Erdogan in the D8 meeting in Jakarta suggested the other way around, suggesting that the interest-free banking is, I don't remember the particular word he used, but it was something that is not going to help the Muslim world to develop. And therefore, political positioning, because those years he was under the influence of liberal economists, and today he has, because the economic circumstances are difficult, therefore the rescuing, the salvation process requires religion as an instrument, but it is not convincing because unfortunately the whole objective of prohibiting interest is justice, and justice is not taking place in the society, and therefore within the constitution of the country, within the party program, not only constitution of the country but party program, the commitment to market system is there. Unless they come up and change and provide an alternative offer, the textbook definition one way or another has to be taken up in order to rescue the diminishing economic realities of Turkey. I hope that was a comment useful.
Thank you very much indeed for your comment, Professor Asutay.
And therefore, perhaps extending that comment, this picture I have from the social media, this is what we have around us. On the one hand, creating financialization and getting people into deep financialization. Heavy financialization has taken place in the last 20 years. Everyone has credit debts. Household debt has increased tremendously in Turkey. And then excluding people from accessibility to resources. And therefore, equity is a solution, of course, which is not happening in the country. But liberty would imply opening the accessibility. And that's very much the Islamic economics position that I try to highlight here. Liberty requires that accessibility to resources that are created by Allah for everyone. Excluding people and then using certain Islamic metaphors to rescue the process, I think it wouldn't help.
So I think there are some other questions. I see someone raising hands, for example, Sami, and after Sami, I see Mehmet artık. And so please, Sami, ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum. I joined a bit late, so I might have just missed some of the other comments, which might be related to what I'm about to say. But me personally, I believe the international monetary system is fundamentally broken, and trying to build on top of that, or trying to Islamize, or make something halal that's fundamentally haram is very much the wrong way to go. I mean, I don't know if someone's actually commented about this. So, for example, in economics, you've got money, and money itself at the moment that we've got is a fiat currency. And if we use Egypt as an example, in 1913 or prior to 1913, before they got invaded by the British, the Egyptian pound was pegged on 7.4 grams of gold. It was very much a strong economy. And then later on, once the Bretton Woods Agreement, then now what we have is pretty much a fiat currency that has no value. And therefore, you've got something that you mentioned, interest rate. And that interest rate is just basically a tool to control inflation, which is caused by the fiat currency. And we wouldn't have this because if we go back to basics or go back to Islam and what Allah prescribed for us as money, according to Islam, which should have an intrinsic value. So that's the first thing that we should do, rather than trying to work around, riba. Is it haram? Yes, it's not. It's incorrect, or that kind of stuff. It wouldn't be an issue to have an interest-free economy if we go back to an intrinsic-based money. That's the point that I wanted to make. I don't know if anyone else has already pointed that out. And we shouldn't ignore what's happening with, cryptocurrency. And I feel that's more like a decoy, because that's another fiat currency. And it's not really a store of value as such. And I think we should really go back to having money which pretty much pegged on a commodity that stores the value. And so far, historically, it's proven that gold and silver and any other precious metal are a good store of value. So that's the field. I feel this is the way that we should be looking at how is cryptocurrency, or how can we develop something that is really halal and built on strong foundation, rather than trying to build something on fundamentally is incorrect. And we should really go back to the way things were. According, to the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and Allah, according to the Quran, and we should really not try to compromise our position. And that's just what
Thank you very much, Sami. I think the money part we haven't gone into discussion, but I didn't try to justify a prohibition of riba as an instrumentalized manner of bringing back the capitalist tendencies. And therefore, my reference point is the whole definition has to be there. And within the existing system, therefore, I have taken up a system analysis and tried the alternative system understanding how that can be developed. And that will have, of course, a particular reference to money and how money can be utilized and can be developed. And that's important. Of course, we have tendencies within the global financial system and global monetary economy. Each Muslim country has been following that, and therefore, unfortunately, the whole debate has been relegated, as I mentioned, to the prohibition of riba, and trade is halal, and therefore you do the same things with the Islamic cover, Islamic worship. But this is not my position, and therefore, within a moral economy of Islam, a particular treatment of money, that money, as you mentioned, cannot be commodity in itself. It has to represent a certain value. And one of the positions that I have taken on the the cryptocurrencies is it is a commodity in itself. It doesn't help. It is furthering the deficiency in the system that we have, fiat money system. Unfortunately, it creates individual hegemonies as well on top of what hegemony we have. Individual hegemonies, individual monopolies, and these are the concerns I have and I share with you. But I do not, on the other hand, share the position with dinarist colleagues, because a number of colleagues within the Islamic economics suggesting the gold dinar. But of course, gold in current times are commodity as well, and that brings commodification process to Islamic economics on the other hand. But I fully share your concerns, and some of those concerns theoretically has been responded here. Thank you.
Yes, dear Mehmet Artık. Are you there?
Yeah, thank you for a nice presentation, Professor Asutay. Actually, the people have a different, since people have a different habitus. When you first mentioned, of course, I remember from the petty statements that he resembled the capital as a blood in the vessels. But a person from the Islamic habitus, when I heard the blood in the vessels, it reminds me the volatility shouldn't be accumulated in any organ of the body.
Yes, that's very
And
good.
it
Yes.
might be
Thank you.
recognized like a connotation and a metaphor rather than from looking from the pro capital perspective on given privilege of the capital.
Yes, certainly. Thank you for reminding that, Mehmet. But not only perhaps the accumulation of that in the body, like metaphor with blood, but also considering that that is the essential for the body to function, or the society or the economy function, is unfortunately very very reductionist understanding as well. Thank you for reminding that.
And also, there's one final question from YouTube chat.
Yep.
So I just pasted to the chat box, and let me also read it. So, how do you interpret the issuance of Islamic sukuk and the use of central banks in their reserves? Question from YouTube.
Okay. Would you mind to repeat that, please? I was just thinking about the anecdote when you were asking that.
Sorry?
Would you mind to repeat, please? Oh, yes, it is here. How do you interpret the issues of Islamic sukuk and the use of central banks in their reserves? Okay. I'm just thinking about an anecdote, whether I should repeat that anecdote or not. But I think I'm not going to repeat the anecdote. But what I want to say on this particular question is that we here in the last 1.5 hours, we try to highlight a particular worldview and particular theoretical framework, and how that theoretical framework can produce a particular political economy and moral economy. Now, whether within that moral and political economy, I'm smiling, I just remember this anecdote, but I'm avoiding to go through here. But within that political economy, within that moral economy, of course, there will be some instruments that we will be able to utilize. Of course, sukuk is an important historical experiment, but of course, with a particular reference to the need of society, the way it is defined by Islamic economics. But the sukuk that operates now, of course, is part of the capital markets, not necessarily, unfortunately, contributing to the betterment of societies, but it has become an instrument of financialization in the process. Now, of course, we have to see how certain sukuk, for instance, in so-called avoiding riba, might contribute to development of infrastructure in the society, or it is contributing or not, even in the conventional sense, not necessarily the Islamic moral economy, but within the existing system, whether sukuk is contributing to development needs of societies, or it is just issued because this is much beneficial way of gaining capital. Such as in Malaysia, sukuk is not heavily, but it is incentivized through financial and the tax incentive system. So for companies, issuing sukuk rather than bond is more attractive because of the incentives. So whether the objective is to serve through Islamic economy to the welfare of the societies, or is it just another means of financialization? And therefore, we have to create that debate. And you have to remember that I think it was about 10 years ago, Sheikh Usman Taki, the leading Sharia scholar in Islamic finance, declared that most of the sukuk that we have in the market is not Sharia compliant even. But later, under the pressure of the market, he had to withdraw his statement. In a similar manner, within the last 4 years, we had this Dana sukuk issue, for instance, which was taken to the court in London. It was a sukuk that was constructed in the United Arab Emirates on the Kurdish petrol, but first they failed financially. They reissued, they restructured, sorry, and then realizing that they are not going to be able to, this United Arab Emirates team, a company, realizing that they are not going to be able to fulfill their promise, they come up with the idea that it is not Sharia compliant in the end. So as we can see, it is very volatile environment that we have, and therefore it is perhaps not necessarily helping to the development of economies. We have to see the quantitative data in front of us, whether within the existing system, whether it is contributing to development objectives of societies as mentioned, or it is another ways of financialization. I mean, we have an empirical paper looking into that. In certain parts, we can see that Sukuk is contributing to development process. But in others, unfortunately, it doesn't. And in particular, the way Sukuk is structured, whether it is Murabaha, Musharaka, Ijara, and etc., that has implications as well. And also whether it is corporate or the sovereign Sukuk. Again, if it's a sovereign Sukuk, it is for the budget deficits of the country, or it is really for the development purpose. So these are important issues that we have to consider in understanding whether Sukuk is contributing to the societies in which it is issued. And of course, use of central banks in their reserves. I'm not sure whether your question in relation to Sukuk or entirely different questions, and therefore I'm not sure. But Sukuk, in order to be effective, we have to see what purpose it has been issued, and most of the Sukuks unfortunately issued for purposes of financialization and financial need. Also, in an empirical study we are currently looking into, and therefore to understand the liquidity implications, Sukuk, most of the Sukuk issued has negative impact on the liquidity of Islamic banks, and therefore you could see that it is very much financial oriented issuance, because then in order to invest, rather than invest in Islamic banks, potential customers are investing onto Sukuk, and which affects the liquidity creation in Islamic banks. In other words, liquidity drawn into the Sukuk, and therefore it directly shows that it's very much the return oriented and financial oriented, rather than contributing to development as such. I hope within that context that is my answer.
Okay, thank you very much for these and previous answers. I think there's no other questions in YouTube, and I think no questions here. So I'm looking. Oh, okay. So dear Asutay, again, thank you very much for this good presentation, and it was really good for us and for all participants, I think. And thank you for questions, for comments, dear Professor Vojitoğlu, dear Mehmet Artık, and others. Also, I think Professor Khan left. So you want to say something?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I know you have great talks taking place. I wish I have time to join them, as well as Dr. Ali Khan kindly attended this session. Hopefully I'm following the talks, amazing line of people that you have brought together. Hopefully I can follow, and thank you for having me. Hopefully it was useful. This is my passion. This is what I do. And hopefully the story, the whole narrative will continue to take shape. And hopefully we will be part of that continuation process, or the development of knowledge in this particular area. But I think beyond my affiliation into particular religious affiliation, I'm intellectually convinced that there is a narrative here, and that narrative is important. Even within the Islamic finance, despite our criticism, certain positive things are happening, and therefore how we can bring this into reality the parallel, the shadow that we have currently, how we can bring that shadow in the reality to make difference in the lives of people, whether in Muslim world or beyond the Muslim world, will be an important contribution in making a difference. Let's hope for that. And thank you for your patience to everyone staying here. And thank you for having me. Thank you.
You're welcome. So thank you very much again. I think we can end the session. Thank you very much.
Thank
again.
you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.